discovered today that we're on the same side of the equation. And that's the most positive thing we could have come away with. We are both united in liberating Lebanon from an occupation power dominated by Iran called Hezbollah, where the only reason we'll need to cross each other's territory will be in business suits to conduct business or in bathing suits to go on vacation.
That was Israeli Ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter, talking about Lebanon, the topic on lots of people's minds, and our number one topic we're going to kick off with today. Matt and Leila, what do you think?
Well, I think there's something to say is that Lebanon and Israel did start negotiating. Maybe yesterday was some kind of setting the platform for the future negotiation, a more serious negotiation, or the results coming out of it, even though each party came with a different goal, like Lebanon wants ceasefire, bringing the displaced people back. Israel came with disarming Hezbollah and the security of their northern fronts. But what happened on the table is something. At the same time, attacks from Israel are still happening. At the same time, yesterday when they were sitting, Bint Jbeil was surrounded by Israelis, and the village of Bint Jbeil, which is my village as well, it happens to have a very important meaning for the Lebanese and for the Israelis. This is where Hassan Nasrallah told the Israelis, this is like he claimed victory from Bint Jbeil in 2000.
Yeah, I think there's another way of thinking about it. Is we live in the virtual world of politics, of ADHD, that we expect things to happen super quickly. Certainly the American president, wants results. And the reality on the ground is you've got over 4 decades of a conflict where it's not quite between Lebanon and Israel. It is a proxy conflict in the 80s between the Palestinians and the PLO in Israel. Sure. Now it's between the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, and Israel. And this will not be resolved in one meeting or even in a few weeks. But I think it fundamentally will not be resolved until Lebanon is a real state. And I think that's really... But
all politics is local, right? And there's a poll by the Israel Democracy Institute that just came out this week that says that 80% of Israelis feel that Israel should keep fighting in Lebanon regardless of any ceasefire agreement and even regardless of whether or not it upsets Washington. So in the end, in terms of domestic opinion in Israel, what's the incentive for Israel to really give?
Well, as long as you have missiles falling on northern Israel, they will move into southern Lebanon. That is a reality of any country's, not just politics, just self-defense. And so I guess my question, I kind of wonder, Leila, this is your country, you know it far better. Is the government of Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, is there any hope in proverbial wherever that they can do anything to try and neutralize Hezbollah and really kind of quiet things down in southern Lebanon, that you could imagine getting to an outcome at the diplomatic table that could find some sort of resolution to what seems like an end to this problem?
I would say yes. They started this path looking at how they did not back down when the streets in Lebanon filled with Hezbollah demonstrators saying that Nawaf Salam is a traitor, and they attacked him and they said a lot of bad things about him. He did not back down. They went into the negotiation, and that's by itself, it's a huge statement. And to your point, Matt, yes, in the 80s it was the PLO, now it's Hezbollah. It's always another war. For other wars in Lebanon, another proxy, it's about sovereignty. And I think Nawaf Salam is saying we need to get back our sovereignty. And the Lebanese army started, I'm not sure how far they can succeed, knowing how the dynamics plays between, even during the time of Joseph Aoun when he was in the army, and Hezbollah, they always have some kind of intelligence together. I'm not sure how this is going to play out now. And this is where the Lebanese army is at a test today, because they should not have any weapons in Beirut to avoid another strikes.
Yeah, but I understand all politics is local, yet the Middle East, everything is regional and everything is interconnected. So in '83, that didn't stop until Arafat was thrown out and sent to Tunis. I think now this is where Lebanon's fate is so tied up in Iran's fate.
It's like Hamas. Did they they lose or did they win? You have to extract this, and it doesn't happen. Ideology, you cannot kill it in one day. It needs years of education.
But even more so, Hezbollah is so weakened. You know, Nasrallah was killed. The leader of Hezbollah was killed in 2024. Their top echelon was decimated. Yet it is still the structures remain in place, and the Iranian control is still there. I think you were telling me that they found an IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps member in Lebanon.
Yes.
But they didn't throw him out. They just put him somewhere else in Lebanon. They said the Iranian ambassador is PNG. Should be out of the country, and yet he's still at the embassy in Beirut.
Yeah.
So
absolutely,
if U.S. has to finish in Iran, if Iran stays status quo, much less strengthened, then I can't imagine that Lebanon is going to get more infected rather than less infected.
And is it for Iran to pull the plug, right? I mean, you know, there are certain situations when the Soviet Union collapsed that put Cuba, for example, in severe trouble. If Iran pulls the plug on its support to Hezbollah, is that really over? Is it over for Hezbollah in Lebanon? How much do they depend on it? Clearly they do, but you kind of wonder whether they can't just keep going on their own.
There's no money going into the country like before. So they're weakened already, Hezbollah, financially and military-wise, because Syria's road and they are being blocked, so they are no longer can smuggle weapons. Yes, they are weakened. But yet again, if you want to weaken and have the idea and the ideology of Hezbollah gone, you need to educate the society again. That's ideology is not easy. It's not like you move one person and you bring another. They have been building this since the 80s, because after the invasion of Israel, this is where Hezbollah started surfacing. It wasn't before that, after the PLO were gone. We need to watch how it's gonna play out. There were 7 points out of the yesterday's negotiation or talks, not gonna say negotiation, talks. There were two important things, and I think we need to keep an eye on it. The reconstruction for Lebanon. So the Americans said if there's going to be the negotiation will result of reconstructions of Lebanon. In 2006, Qatar and Kuwait and some of the Gulf countries did help building back Lebanon. Now who's gonna build back? You have more than 1 million people displaced. Who's gonna build back and send them back to their homes? This is something very important, how it's gonna play out with the population in Lebanon. That's one. And second, which is very important, is the US, that's why they don't want any other mediator, not France, not because France used to have an influence in Lebanon. They want a prolonged peace treaty. So these are two important things that will change the dynamics in Lebanon.
Do you see yourself going back anytime soon and visiting a peaceful Lebanon, Leila?
I'm gonna visit in the summer, but I'm not sure if it's gonna be peaceful. Every time I go down, and in November I was in Bint Jbeil. I was in the village itself, and I took a ride across the whole border, Aitarun, Marun al-Ras, all the areas, and I've seen the demolition of places and houses. Seeing it, it's so hard. It's not as you hear about it on television. It hurts, and you blame everybody on it. It's so sad.
What is the I mean, we were told a couple things. One, tensions with Israel longstanding. I know how Lebanese feel about Israel, but people are angry at Hezbollah.
Of course.
And is that translating into diminishing their influence in the country, or they don't care because they have a core supporters that are saying go on, go forward, and they have the Iranian backers?
Very good question. You do have the core who supports Hezbollah now. They are divided. Now you start hearing raised voices. Before they used to be afraid, saying you brought this on us. Yes, they are saying, yes, we know Israel is the enemy, but you brought them in. They were peacefully in their borders since 2006. You brought them on when you started supporting Gaza. So since 2006, you didn't have this escalation whatsoever. And Lebanon was being prosper, money was flooding in. So that's one. No, yes, you start hearing the voices. The biggest flip is with the other parties in Lebanon, because politically, Lebanon is not only Hezbollah and the movement of Amma, the Shia movement. So the other parties, the political parties, everybody now are saying, fine, Israel is not our favorite. They even say they are enemies, but we need to have peace with them. So this is where things have changed. Before, it was different. Now, it's surfacing. So yes, to your point, things are changing between the core people who support Hezbollah and the political parties who are partners in Lebanon.
Yeah, you know, the line about the bathing suits and the business suits, that's a little bit what happened in the Gulf after the Abraham Accords. Obviously, this conflict has sort of shaken that up, but that is a very compelling vision. Unfortunately, long experience in the Middle East makes it hard to feel overly optimistic that things can really change, and certainly not change quickly.
Well, on that optimistic note, Matt, let's talk about the other obstacles to the next steps in ending this war. So we have, in addition to Lebanon, clearly we have the nuclear issue, a lot of disagreement apparently. It emerged after the failed talks last weekend on how far apart the U.S. and Iran actually were. And we have, of course, the Strait of Hormuz. And boy, is that something to unpick, right? It's been mined by the Iranians, and they don't even necessarily know where the mines are. We have ships maybe passing through, maybe not. CENTCOM says they're not. China is in there. It's, and they talk about the talks resuming sometime in the next couple of days, and it's going to be interesting how they're going to deal with nuclear and Hormuz right off the bat.
Look, I mean, we talked about, the election. The first election of Donald Trump was the first Twitter election. This is really the first Twitter conflict, or maybe we call it the X conflict, that things move so quickly that it's hard to kind of keep your mind straight. And that's also driven by, President Trump, who one day says we're going to annihilate Iran, another day says the war is over, and a third day acknowledges that the talks didn't go well, but then wants to get back into the negotiations. That is his style. It also is the way, because he is the most powerful person in the world, that is the way the world has to adjust to him in some ways, and so do we, to analyze what's going on. It is dizzying. I guess a couple of things. One, for me, is in the Gulf, I think the support for this conflict is, they're not happy about it, but they are, I think, more committed to the U.S. alliance than before, because the alternative is even worse, which is a strengthen Iran's. They want this finished. You have the global economic dimension. The IMF is in town here behind us in Washington meeting. They're reducing their forecasts for global growth. We are talking about potentially $200 per barrel oil price if this continues too long. And then Iran, where Trump is betting that enough pain and serious pain can bring them to heel. They also have 90 million people who may go hungry, are certainly poor. The last card is really the U.S. domestic card, and that is, I think, where President Trump is having, in some ways, the hardest time in controlling the narrative and winning the narrative. Never mind his opposition in the U.S., but I think he's feeling the heat from very important coalitions within his grand tent. One is, the MAGA isolationists. J.D. Vance was down earlier this week at the University of Georgia, was heckled by conservative students over Iran. And then you have the business elite, which is, again, in town this week in Washington at the IMF bank fund meetings, and they're obviously very concerned about this. So I think continuing the analogy, things moving super quickly, there's a lot of pressure to finish this off sooner than later. And I think others here are worried about that.
Yeah, no, it is worrying. It's and I mean, they may extend the ceasefire, who knows? But technically, right now, it's going to end next Tuesday on the 21st. So it's
what I
up
could
on the
see
air.
the worries, Anders and Matt, not only domestically and in here. Like, look how this played out and how Trump did turn the table on the Iranians. They used Strait of Hormuz as energy leverage. And who was impacted by that? I'm not going to speak about China and Russia. Let's talk about people who are allies with the US, Japan and India. So what Japan did, the prime minister came into the US in March with one objective in mind, Japan first, right? She found herself sitting in Washington with a very pressure heated up meeting where the US wanted their support on the military operation. She simply said no. They chose to work around with Iran and have their ships passing through. So they made a direct deal. They did work around it. So they chose energy because they're going to be at risk over politics. Go to India. What Iran did with India was a little bit different. They told India, do not align with the US, stay neutral, we'll let you pass. And they took the deal. Now with the blockade, the US are going to suffocate Iran economically. But at the same time, there are the other ships who had a workaround. So so now this workaround became a liability. So Trump, it's no longer US versus Iran. It's who controls the energy. And it's also poking on the who really were neutral to backing this operation.
And so I was thinking one of the knock-on effects of some of this stuff is ways we can't even imagine. For example, when the U.S. redeploys naval forces into the Middle East, it's actually pulling them out of the Western Pacific. So there's a whole other calculation, which is that then, by definition, it can't be everywhere at the same time. And I'm sure that Beijing is also watching at the fact that the U.S. is pretty busy and maybe it can do something in the Pacific.
As we were saying, this is such a, again, driven by the American president's habit of being on his phone at all hours of the day, saying things that are contradictory or surprising or outrageous. But
he's the news man.
He makes
the news.
He's one of the most talented media operators, if not the most talented media figures, not much less political figures. But there's a bigger question here, and I think this is something which I can assume is on the mind of the White House, or at least one presumes is on the mind of the White House, is that this is the biggest test. It's not the one they expected or intended. This is the biggest test in Trump's 2 terms in office of American credibility and American power. I think they went in thinking, we're going to hit him hard, rattle the place, see what happens. If the regime falls, great, but we'll get a deal quickly. We're in and out like Venezuela. What it has turned out to be is it's called into question the future of the NATO alliance, partly by the U.S. itself. So that is weakening potentially deterrence in Europe on the front against Russia. As Anders mentioned, moving all those ships out of the Pacific weakens the deterrence in the Pacific theater. And China, which began the war, we thought, didn't say a word really, didn't want to support Iran, wanted to see how this plays out, and it felt like, they're losing again. They lost in Venezuela, they're losing again. Now, I think they see an opportunity that this is going to be, potentially if the U.S. misplays this longer term, a way for them to kind of raise their stature globally. Xi is playing statesman. He's invoking, the importance of an international rules-based order. They also need the oil, but I think this may be, the U.S. may either end up stronger or significantly weaker as a global power in a conflict that it thought was limited and regional in scope.
I have a question for you. I want to understand what exactly you meant when you say that the White House, are you talking about when Trump leaves office and somebody else comes in? So this is not going to impact the U.S. credibility because Trump is the U.S. at the end. So is it about individuals or it's about the U.S. itself?
It's about the U.S. itself. I think this has this will have, books will be written about this period in American history, in America's engagement with the world. And I was couching, it's not clear with this White House. I mean, on the one hand, it's the most transparent White House we've ever seen because the president tells you what's on his mind live, almost. But we don't really know who is in the room, who he counts on, who are his counselors, what the debates are. So I said, I presume they have in mind the larger implications for U.S. credibility and power in the world, but I'm not sure. And we don't sense, I mean, certainly Donald Trump is not describing the conflict in those terms. But I do think at the same time that he seems to, it's so hard to tell, but there are people who are close to him to tell me that he is in this for the long haul, that he understands the stakes here, and that he understands that his legacy is on the line, and he can live with high oil prices or even a disastrous midterm that he's probably factored in because he's not running for office again. And he wants to finish this right. Certainly people in the Gulf are saying this because I don't know if they're hoping this is the case or if they have been told that is the case.
I want to quote here Ambassador Ryan Crocker. He said, getting into a war is not like getting out of the war. Getting into the war is easier, but getting out of it...
That's always true, right?
Yeah.
Because you're only one person decides who gets in. Many people decide how you get out. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Andres. Really, what are the Iranian inside Iran are saying? Nobody knows. We hear the exact people. They can speak. They can say that the people are against the regime, and we've seen demonstrations in Iran against the regime, and they killed 30,000 or more, the IRGC from the population who went against them. But what really the people are saying now? Do they have some kind of bound what's happening with Iran, with the
Absolutely.
government? What is it?
I mean, there are a number of factors. One of them is if you're inside Iran, other than the fact that, there's been a war going on that people have felt personally, we don't talk about it much in the West now after a few months, but people have not forgotten what happened on January 8th and 9th when, whatever the figure is, but it's in the high thousands of people were just massacred. Machine guns were set up and just mowed down people. And I think for a lot of people, they're still kind of reeling from that because that was such a shocking and blatant display of raw power and suppressing sort of demonstrations that in the view of the regime.
Do you hear anything about now? No, this is, nobody can forget that, but now, is there anything that getting out of Iran about how the Iranians are really feeling towards that?
Well, it's too. Well, yeah. Bearing in mind, of course, that the internet has now been down for over 1,000 hours. It's apparently the longest internet shutdown of any country ever. Controlled from the top. Basically, you have two schools. One of them is, we really want this to end. We don't want to be bombed anymore. Fine, we can live with this. It's a terrible regime, but it's nowhere near falling apparently. And then you have people who are waiting for that regime change and waiting for things that in essence were promised, which is that was one of the aims of this war. Various things were said about hold on and wait and so on. And people who are willing to undergo, extreme privations in order to finally have that regime change happen. But of course, as time goes on and it's clear that it's nowhere in sight, I think people are dejected, people are sad, people kind of feel, well, okay, the big one didn't happen. We thought the demonstrations might do it. Then we thought that the U.S. intervention might do it. It hasn't happened. And it's something that's been building in Iran for so many years. We hear about the 47 years. 47 years does take its toll. And what I've noticed over the past few years is people are just fed up. They turn inward. Hopes have been dashed time and again. Each time there's a demonstration, it gets beaten down. The sanctions, are they affecting the longevity of the regime or not? Basically, people feel the effect of the sanctions in their own pocketbooks while the elites go and have, nice lives and families living in the West and so on. It's this turning in, it's this kind of dejection of what's left? Like nothing seems to work. And so it's not hope. It's just kind of, it's somewhere between despair and hopelessness, if there's such a space. It's really depressing because people don't have anything to look forward to now. They've had a brief glimmer of, well, maybe outside intervention is actually going to finally do the trick. But absent any sign of that, there's kind of just almost an I give up.
I hear a lot of frustration from the Iranians that you hear interviewed who either have gone to Turkey or who are somehow reached in Iran itself, and frustration with the U.S. and Israel as well. And I think, and in that frustration, you see that there was real elation. Remember that scene when Khamenei was killed on February 27th? People came out, they were celebrating in Tehran. That is gone. And I think there's an acceptance that that blow is not what is not what's going to topple this regime. But then you say, it's not the day after.
But
it's the day after, the day after. Maybe now the thing is, let's stop this fighting. And I think that's probably maybe the Israeli and the U.S. strategy now is, we weaken the regime, and let us hope that 3 months, 6 months from now, you'll see that domestic upswell.
And it's a good point. I think for a lot of people, the goals of the U.S. and Israel aren't their goals, right? People don't really care about the nuclear program. Obviously, Israel and the U.S. do. But people, and this has been going back for ages, if you talk to any Iranian, as long as the nuclear issue has been on the table, they're like, I don't care. I mean, of course, you have hardcore, like, oh, we have the right to enrich uranium, or some who probably feel that Iran, the Islamic Republic, has a right to join the nuclear club. But if you ask your average person, like, for years now, people just don't care. And yet, of course, that's a key thing for Iran, for Israel and the U.S. And Hormuz as well. People are like, Hormuz, Shmormuz. Like,
no, they won't care now, Andres, because Hormuz with the blockade, this is turning off every money it's gonna get inside Iran, and they're already struggling, and there's already an economical crisis. If this blockade worked on Iran, so there's no more fuel out or oil out, their livelihood is in danger. Not only the regime, it's also the people. And on the long run, it will destroy whatever things they have from all their wells will be destroyed if the blockade continued and Iran was not able to get out oil of Hormuz. So no, they would, I think this is another pressure point. It's going to impact not only the regime, it's going to impact the population in Iran as well.
It will have an impact. The regime itself estimates that the war thus far has cost them $270 billion, right? And that's after less than 7 weeks. Yeah, it's hitting people. It's also interesting that what the war has also exposed is there have always been cracks. No regime is monolithic. If you sort of start to look inside, is monolithic in terms of how they control. But obviously, there are people who are up and down and have more power and less power. Well, in this whole vacuum, yes, again, Mujtaba, where is he? Who knows? But it's definitely, we've noticed this, of course, in previous podcasts as well, the rise of the power of the IRGC, as if it could be even stronger than it was. But there are some, apparently the IRGC wanted a seat at the table in Islamabad, and that was pushed back. But there's definitely kind of a jostling. Pezeshkian is not exactly in a powerful position. Araghchi, the speaker, foreign minister, and Kalibaf as the speaker.
Kalibaf is an ex-IRGC.
Yes, exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because it's a classic situation where you're going to have, hardliners are going to say, well, look, see, you can't trust them. We're going to stick this out to the end. And then you're going to have some people who are going to say, look, we're tired of this. Let's just concede something. So the next few days are going to be key. They really are going to be key. There have been hints that the ceasefire talks are going to resume again. We'll see. Something has to happen. Either they get extended or the ceasefire expires on Tuesday. It's hard to picture that it's going to go back to full-scale war again after Tuesday if the clock does run down. But Yeah, we'll just, who knows what it'll look like a week from now for our next podcast.
On that note,
yes, I want to thank you both, Matt Kaminsky, the editorial chair of MBN, Leila Bazi, the editor-in-chief of MBN, Marwan Munir and Omar Lahberi, who are both editing and producing the podcast today. And for you out there watching us and listening to us, be sure to check us out on all the different platforms that we're on Spotify, on Apple, on YouTube, certainly on the MBN website as well. Subscribe to the newsletters. MBN has a newsletter twice a week. There is also the Iran newsletter that comes out twice a week. And China Tracker, lots of things to get engaged with, lots of things to get involved in. Rate us, only if it's a 5. And keep checking us out and keep being part of the conversation. Thank you.